Well, we've had 30 years since the beginning of transition in 1989, and every 5 years we draw new lessons about the process of transition. I think the most interesting and important lesson at this point is to see to what extent the countries that were communist before 1989 have been affected by the world economy and the structure of the world economy. Countries that had resources that were in demand have basically concentrated more and more on the export of those resources, things like oil and gas. Countries that were close to Western Europe have integrated much more into the West European economy. Trade flows have increased. There's been investment in factories that are part of the production chains leading to Western Europe in places like Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. But other countries have had a much more difficult time finding a niche in the global economy. And I think although we tend to attribute the problems of these countries to the communist legacy and the difficulties of completely changing the economic system, although that's clearly a huge part of the challenge, we tend to underestimate just how difficult a task it was to find a new economic direction given the structure of the world economy, especially in the 90s and 2000s, when China was rising as a major trade power, when the opportunities for innovation were really getting tighter and tighter with competition from many already developed, highly developed countries, and with a growing level of technology, with the spread of cell phones, computing, and so on. All of that was happening at the time that these former communist countries were having to reorient completely, basically write off most of their previous capital stock and find a new direction. So I think a lot of the problems were not specifically about having been communist, but rather were about being a somewhat developed country without a clear niche in the international economy at a time of accelerating change. So if we look at the data for the world as a whole, and we look at just about any indicator or measure of democracy around the world, we see that there's been perhaps a slight decline or no decline at all. Most indicators suggest that the proportion of countries in the world that are democratic today is at or close to an all-time high. So the question is, why do people believe that there's been substantial backsliding? Well, there has been significant backsliding in certain very important countries. So in Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, it's quite clear. In Russia, I would say, although it's a difficult regime to categorize in any period, clearly things have not been moving in a more democratic direction. Same with Turkey, and in the US. Many people have real concerns about the degree to which it is today a liberal democracy. Nobody doubts that it's democratic, but the quality of the democracy may have deteriorated to some extent. Many people feel that. So why do they generalize? Well, we tend to forget that the trends in different parts of the world can be quite different. So we focus on the most salient countries. But for instance, in Africa, since 1999, the proportion of democracies has increased from about 20% to 40%. These are not perfect democracies, but electoral democracy has really spread. So in some parts of the world, there's a dynamic of still forward movement towards more democracy, even as in some of the most developed democracies and in some of the democracies in Eastern Europe, there's at least a decline in quality. I think that's a big part of the reason, and the other part of the reason is that we are most focused on our own countries. So in the US, people see deeply problematic things happening under the current president. Disrespect for the courts, disrespect for the media, attempts to ignore congressional investigations, to sidestep subpoenas, and so on. And this clearly should worry people, but that doesn't mean we should necessarily generalize and see a trend that is occurring across the board, across the world, just because of that.
Do you find these trends disturbing? Because democratic backsliding in some countries can be more dangerous than in others.
Yes, of course, it's very concerning. But I think we need to understand what's happening worldwide in order to have a sense of, the strengths and weaknesses of democracy. I think we need to distinguish between certain types of countries which are quite vulnerable to backsliding, and others which, although the quality may deteriorate, are unlikely to revert to authoritarianism. And political scientists have studied this, and what we found is that countries that are relatively highly economically developed and countries that have been democratic for a long time, many consecutive years of democracy, almost never revert to full-fledged authoritarianism. There are ups and downs in the quality, but major reversions just don't seem to happen. Now, the pattern that we see in past data is not guaranteed to continue in the future, but at least based on the history of democracy and regimes around the world over the last 2 centuries, it seems we should distinguish between the highly economically developed countries which have been democratic for a long time and other countries which are less economically developed and have not been democratic for so long, such as countries in Eastern Europe, some of the countries in Latin America, although many of those have now been democratic for quite a long period. And we need to view these particular questions in context. What's a fragile regime in one country may not be in another. Absolutely. There's no. So what we see in the data is not a deterministic relationship that says certain types of countries are bound to revert to authoritarianism or even to have deteriorating quality democracies. What we see is a general pattern, and it's probabilistic. So clearly there are actions that leaders can take. There are circumstances which make a difference for whether a given country in a given year will move in one direction or another. And yes, we should try to understand these conditions that either facilitate backsliding or else make it harder and do what we can. But still, I think it's important, given that we don't always have a lot of influence over these countries, to look at the big picture and try to understand just how great the threats are in a particular case. Well, Hungary and Poland were both relatively new democracies. Now, Poland, most experts still classify it as a democracy. The quality has deteriorated. It's often called a populist democracy. Hungary, I think a lot of experts these days, and I would also be on this side, consider it now a soft authoritarian regime, just because the Orban administration has concentrated power to such an extent that it seems unlikely that they would give up power very easily. So, first factor, relatively young democracies. Second factor, they're both quite developed now. They're reasonably high GDP per capita, but they're not at the levels of Western Europe or North America. And that makes it some difference. The other thing to bear in mind is we tend to extrapolate the trends that we see. We tend to assume things are going to continue in the same direction. It could also be that Poland and Hungary will, in the next few years, start to move in the opposite direction. I'm not saying that'll happen, but I'm saying we shouldn't assume that negative trends that we've seen in the last few years will necessarily continue. So I think level of economic development, the number of years of consecutive democracy, both of those suggest that Poland and Hungary should not be considered as securely democratic as, say, the countries of Western Europe. Yes. So with Sergei Guriev, in work I've been doing, we look at the way various authoritarian regimes operate these days, and we see the model as being quite distinct in some ways from many previous authoritarian regimes. So if we think of the classic dictatorship of the 20th century, many of these were extremely violent. They killed sometimes tens of thousands of citizens, members of the opposition or perceived members of the opposition. They put many thousands of people in prison for political reasons. It was highly repressive. They often also used ideology in a kind of heavy-handed way, imposing an official ideology on the population, sometimes brainwashing. So that was a model of dictatorship that seemed quite characteristic in the 20th century. What we see more these days, although there are... Okay, but the new model of authoritarian government is rather different. The leaders, instead of using massive violence or very clear repression, try to get the same objective, which means concentrating power in their hands, but in a different way, by manipulating information and convincing the general public that the leader is actually doing a good job, that he's democratic, that he's following democratic rules, and that any bad events that occur are because of outsiders or unavoidable forces from somewhere else that he's not responsible for. So the model is to create an image of competence, to blur the lines between their regime and democratic regimes, and to generate genuine popularity rather than trying to rule through fear, trying to rule through kind of general comprehensive ideology or anything like that. So I think we see versions of this new kind of dictatorship in places like Hungary under Orban and Russia under Putin, Turkey under Erdogan, although his model has become somewhat more violently repressive in recent years, places like Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. And it strikes us that it's quite a new phenomenon, that the trend has really shifted from the 20th century, where dictators like Hitler, Mao, or even Latin American military juntas were much more the norm. In terms of dealing with these regimes? Yeah. So given that we're facing a new type of authoritarian model, what should Western democracies do to try and defend against such regimes? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that the kind of information manipulation techniques they develop to control their own population can be used in foreign policy. And we've seen informational autocrats, as Sergei Guriev and I call them, using informational techniques to try to influence politics in other countries, especially at times of elections. So in the US, 2016 elections and in various European elections. We see less violence, and these regimes, I think, try to avoid violence, although they do get into small wars. I think mostly when it serves some kind of mobilizing purpose at home. So we need to, first of all, understand the kind of techniques that they will use. Secondly, try to build up our resistance to those. And perhaps most important, we need to present a positive image of democracy to the world, because basically it's a competition of ideas in the end. They're able to say to their citizens, the West is hypocritical, the West violates, abuses human rights, violates the principles that Western countries claim to adhere to, and therefore, democracy is a sham, or at least their democracy is no better than our democracy. And in order to counteract that argument, we need to be able to stand by our principles and demonstrate commitment to basic principles of democracy, liberalism, and respect for human rights. So that ultimately is the most important thing, but there are various kinds of defenses that we need to build up against potential interference from such regimes.